For the artistic types, especially that are listening, and for those who might be otherwise stymied by their own integrity, you should take the problem of how to optimize your content production and to communicate it. You should think about that as a creative problem in and of itself. Now, I haven't looked into search engine optimization and that sort of thing much personally.
You don't want it.
Yeah, well, that doesn't mean that my staff hasn't.
Okay.
Right, and so we're very attuned to the necessity of staying on the cutting edge of the communication platforms. You can't have contempt for your audience. And if your respect for your audience is also aligned with your desire to broaden your influence and also to increase your financial opportunity, then that's a nice alignment of motivation, right? And there's nothing wrong with that if you get everything in its proper place. Okay, so you were writing. Now you said you had valuable content, and you started to realize that you could produce information that was as valuable as that which was being offered by people who are already successful. Okay, how did you develop that ability, and why, and how did you come to that realization?
So I suppose one of my greatest assets is when I become interested in something, I become enthralled in it to where I want to learn as much as I can to be top 0.01% in knowledge in that specific discipline. So in those exact topics I was talking about, I was just so hyper interested in them that I was currently researching them heavily, but I'd also been previously for over half a decade, perhaps 7-8 years at that point. So for me, it felt like I had some sort of life experience that was worth actually writing about, and had been in the trenches and done certain things that were of value rather than just regurgitating.
And they were genuine.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, so that's very cool, all of that. So we did a study with this program called self-authoring, a part of it called future authoring. It has people develop a vision for their life. So to do that, you think 5 years down the road and you imagine, like honestly, if you were taking care of yourself, what could your life be like if it was the way you would like it to be, right? And that's a vague and complex question, and so we also break it down for people. What would your intimate relationship look like? Friendships, business, educational opportunities. How would you take care of yourself mentally and physically? How would you use your free time, so-called free time, most productively? How might you serve other people, right? So more differentiated. Okay, so now we had students do this program for 90 minutes, no coaching, nothing. No one ever looked at what they wrote before they went off to university, and also when they were in university. If they completed that rather than a writing exercise of equivalent length, they were 50% less likely to drop out in the first year. 50%. Right, now the biggest effect, this is where it's really cool. The biggest effect was in young men. And the biggest effect was in young men who had a not so stellar academic career. Right. So, and you might imagine that part of the reason they were underperforming, I mean, there's intellectual reasons for underperformance and there's reasons of discipline. But one of the reasons was they had no compelling reason to do anything. Right, now I think it's a truism for men that they won't do a bloody thing until they find something that calls. Now women, like, they're propelled along their developmental path by biological necessity in a way that men aren't. It's like, you better have your act together by 30 when you're a woman, because otherwise you're in trouble. You're a man, you can monkey around till you're Abraham's age, like 75, and you're still not scraped off the planet, you know? Yeah. So, but you know, you said you hit a gold mine in some ways. And then what else you said that was cool was that, see, it was also dependent to some degree on your genuine knowledge, not just some abstract knowledge, as you'd already disciplined yourself in a variety of manners that you could describe. If I've got this right, that was helpful. So let's delve into that a little bit. So, okay, so now you've got business partners, you've got a plan to move forward, that's it, on the writing front, and then you start making YouTube videos. You've got some mentors. So these are good ways to start a business, right? Find someone who knows how to do it and, you know, see if you can latch yourself onto them in some manner that's mutually productive and learn, okay? And then you could dive into your own experience. Okay, so what did you know? How old were you when you started the blog?
23.
Okay, so pretty young. So what did you know at that time that you felt was worth sharing that other people obviously appreciated? And how did you manage to build up that body of knowledge?
In general, it was my transformation from being what I deemed to be essentially, you wouldn't even perceive that I exercise when I was probably 16, 15 years old. I was a rail, like 138 pounds, had no muscle to speak of, one of the thinnest kids on my basketball team.
How tall were you?
6'1".
Oh yeah, that's about exactly the size I was when I started weightlifting. Size and weight, yeah.
So
pretty sad. How much could you bench press when you started?
Oh, not even the bar.
Oh, yeah. That's worse than me. That's really sad, man.
So
I could manage 75 pounds, but it was a struggle.
Nice. Yeah. So for me, I had gone from, benching less than a girl to being able to do reasonable feats in the gym and be what would be considered to be a good physique to 99% of people, essentially, even in the fitness industry.
And when did you start that?
Probably around 17.
Okay, and how did that come about?
Primarily through my friends who were all in the gym and making progress, and I was the only one who was only playing basketball and not in the gym.
Right. So, and you were also on a basketball team, so you had that in on the athletic side. Yeah. See, I didn't play sports much when I was a kid, partly because I skipped a grade, so I was younger than my peers, and that put me at a disadvantage. So one of the things you see, for example, is NHL stars are way likely to be the oldest kids in their class. Like being older, it's a huge advantage on the athletic front to be even a year older, and a huge disadvantage to be a year younger. Anyways, I didn't have the impetus of team sports participation until I went off to graduate school, and that's because I started playing team sports then, and that's also when I started to work out. Okay, so you
look ahead so slow,
good indication
so
of
painfully
your
slow.
peer network and your mentoring group. You had people around you who were doing this, and you could see success on their side. So you went off to the gym. What was it like to go to the gym when you first started to go?
Like the first couple of weeks, you're essentially a cripple because you're so sore. But this is like, it's when you have a virgin muscle as you work it out, and it feels like you've been destroyed. But after a while, you start to adapt and you start to see the scale climbing, especially as a good positive reinforcement that you visually see. Even if in the mirror I'm not perceiving insane amounts of progress, I can see metrics of change on a numbers basis too that are representing progress, and clearly the strength numbers are changing because on a long-term basis.
Yeah, so that's an advantage of weightlifting because it gives you those objective metrics very quickly.
Because if you just go by the mirror, it's very easy to get discouraged. Because it takes years to
go from
I
just wasted
what appears
like
to be untrained to
30 seconds of not clearing lines.
Jacked.
Yeah.
So for me, a lot of it was like positive peer pressure, I suppose, in that my friends were all doing it and I felt kind of like left out if I didn't. So I sort of
weak and useless and isolated. Plus unattractive. So that's a bad combination.
Just by association, I started to go and saw pretty fast results, and to me that was enough to get, bit by the iron bug is what they call it, where you're so you become addicted to the results. Maybe addicted is too strong of a phrase, but like you really enjoy the process.
It's a habit anyways. And it's integrated into your life.
So I had a really positive experience, and for me, it just consumed such a large part of my life, learning about it and educating myself to the extreme degree, even on the performance enhancement side, that it felt worthwhile to start writing about what I had learned to date. And perhaps at the time, I think my knowledge now compared to then, it was a semblance then of it is now. But back then, it felt still valuable enough and worthwhile. And I guess proportionally to the concentration of content online at that time was still like top whatever percent.
Well, the thing is too, no matter where you are in your stage of development in relationship to your goal, there are people who are behind you. And so even if you don't know everything, and you're still somewhat even simple-minded in your approach, that might be exactly what the people who are in even worse shape than you need to hear. Like I always knew, it was often the case when I was lecturing as a professor that it was the easiest time for me to lecture was when I was just learning the material. Because by the time you get to be an expert at something, you forget what people don't know. Right. And then you speak. That's exactly right. Yeah. So the reason I'm highlighting that is because, people who are listening might think, well, I don't know anything in regard to themselves, maybe in regard to me too. But that doesn't mean that the place you're currently standing isn't worth describing and sharing, because it could be extremely useful for people for whom you're in their zone of proximal development. So one of the things kids do that's very interesting, when kids mature, they'll often pick a friend that's slightly older than them, someone they look up to, but they tend to pick a person like that who is doing things they could conceivably do, so like a 3-year-old isn't gonna hero worship at like a 14-year-old because the gap is too great, but he might develop a tremendous admiration for the 4-year-old down the street. He's got a little bit more physical skill. It's in his zone of proximal development, and as a teacher, that's the zone you should inhabit, and that's a very wide zone depending on the people that you're interacting with. So it's reasonable to have some confidence in your own knowledge if you've actually come by it, honestly, let's say.
That's likely a big component of what motivated me to pursue the whole thing to begin with too, is because Chris, similar to I, was kind of at the time, a bodybuilder meathead kind of guy who I deemed to be outside the realm of my sphere of interest and had what was a higher level of education at the time and success, but it was within like the proximal range of achievement for what I could conceive I could get to, and what he had accomplished was very impressive and something I wanted to achieve myself.
Once your business gets to a certain size, cracks start to emerge, and things you used to do in a day are now taking over
takeaways that are significantly relevant to your current state and time. And perhaps that was a big component as well. Is I didn't really log like vlogging necessarily on YouTube, but people can absolutely see my development in real time as I publish content. So perhaps following my education along as I educated myself, similar to what you mentioned, was a big factor.
So what did you have? Okay, so I'm thinking of this Acton Academy. It's a school that helps people develop their own self-motivation, let's say. And one of the exercises that the Acton Academy has, it's very young people do, like 12 years old, is identify a domain of business that they might be interested in pursuing, and then writing a letter to someone in that business, attempting to describe to that person why entering a mentoring relationship with them would be useful, right? Would be interesting and useful. And so you can imagine that helps the kids learn to write a letter like that and to think that through. But also, one of the things you want to do if you're looking for a mentor and figuring out how to develop yourself is to find someone who can teach you. But you can't just go begging for that. There has to be a quid pro quo. So with the people that served as your mentors, what do you think it was that you had to offer to make the relationship work?
Fortunately, I had enough existing content via their own platforms by posting my own self-improvement journeys even before I was blogging. So prior to that,
you've done your homework.
Yeah, so I had already kind of shown evidence of some level of acumen and success in the niches that I'm speaking of. And that's kind of what led Chris to even contact me to say, at one point he had contacted me, hey, do you want to do a guest post on my website? And you write top 10, like commonly overlooked something of bodybuilding.
Yeah, so you had some proof of previous performance. Well, I just talked to a young guy who sent me 2 months ago, he sent me a bunch of a number of online AI projects that he had built out of my material. He didn't ask me if he could do that. And he wanted some of my time, but what he came armed with was these projects. And so I thought, well, I might as well take a look at them. And when I looked at them, I thought, oh, okay, this might be worth, half an hour talking to this kid. And so he had already positioned himself so he was a credible communicator, right? Someone I might be interested in having a chat with. And so, it's very useful to understand how it is you can position yourself so that, because if you want something from someone, you should put yourself in a position where the easiest thing for them to say is yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and I often see, it's interesting because I hear entrepreneurs speak of this often, how if you want to stand out, be willing to work for free or show some value that you're trying to
make an offering.
Give something of value to the person, that don't just try and take or ask for time or anything like that. And while that is common advice, I actually see a shockingly few amount of people actually go out and implement it. And even when they do, the way they go about it is often wrong, in my opinion. Like they are producing something that is what they think is valuable rather than finding insights from that person's content or something that they can extrapolate out as that person deems it as value. So how can I go about accomplishing
So they're not making a bridge.
Yeah, so sometimes I get reached out to 100 times a month. Hey, can I make thumbnails for you? Here's examples of thumbnails that I've supposedly created. Like, how about you just send me one that might have looked good of you took raw footage yourself and made a great thumbnail and sent it to me in an email. Maybe it would have taken you how many minutes, but you would have stood out from 99% of other people in that moment. Or the AI thing. I've had some people reach out about AI stuff too, where, hey, what if you could consolidate all of your preventative medicine, health, optimization information in one AI robot? Here's an example. Often I find, as of now, those are relatively inaccurate, but it's a good idea to show value that could be something the person you're seeking would actually deem to be worth interacting with.
Well, so another thing that I really noticed with the undergraduates at the university, there are a lot of students and not many professors. Like I think in the psych department at the U of T, there's like 300 students for one professor. So developing a relationship with a professor was a tricky business. And it's really necessary to develop such a relationship at some point in your life because you can't get mentored properly. And then you don't have that pathway that you described, you know? That's a big problem. So a lot of what a university education is, if you're fortunate, is a sequence of mentoring and apprenticeship experiences. But I'd have, you know, students show up to my office and say, you know, can I work in your lab? And you have to be careful who you work with because you don't have to bring very many people in who aren't oriented properly for the whole bloody thing to turn into a nightmare. Like 1 in 30 is probably enough. One bad apple in 30 is enough to sink the ship. That's a terrible mixed metaphor, but it's true. I helped with a sequence of courses that were designed to produce entrepreneurs all around the world. I think the company that did this, it was founded, the Thunder Institute, founded in California. And they found that if they had one person in a class of 50 who was tilted in the dark tetrad direction, narcissistic, psychopathic, Machiavellian, that was enough to sink the whole course. So you got to be careful. So anyways, these students would come and say, you know, do you have any opportunities? And usually I had a lot of projects bouncing around in the air, a lot of them only potential and not manifest in any ways. And so I'd often say, well, you know, here's a problem I'm trying to solve. Why don't you go do some research on that and come back and answer this question for me? And then the students would bifurcate. There'd be two responses to that. One would be one group of kids would come back like a week later, say they had a week deadline. They'd come back on time. They'd come back and over-deliver, but not insanely, but, you know, they went a little bit beyond the call of duty, and they provided something that was actually useful. And I'd think, oh, that means I could give you something and you could do it, and it would be less trouble for me than doing it myself, which is sort of why you hire someone. But then there was another category of people who would come back and say, well, you know, I couldn't get this finished. And then they'd have 5 reasons why not. And often they were plausible reasons, you know. But when I delved into the life circumstances of the people who did come back with it finished, they'd had just as many problems. They just didn't let their problems stop them. Now, if there was a death in the family or something, you know, cataclysmic, well, fair enough, maybe, because you don't get that many opportunities, you know, so you should capitalize on them. But so this goes along with the statistics show too that if you work 10% longer hours, you make 40% more money. And you can imagine that just in a workplace. Like, imagine you're running a restaurant and you're going to hire some dishwashers and you want to figure out which ones to keep because most of them aren't going to do the job and most of them will quit. And one of them comes 15 minutes early and leaves 15 minutes late. And you might think, I'm not giving that bloody capitalist 1 extra minute of my time. It's like, yeah, well, don't think he won't notice. You know, a little bit above and beyond pays incredible. It segregates you from your competition, right? And at work, if you are willing to go that extra mile and you're smart enough also to non-manipulatively make that known, you know, because people have to see what you're doing too. That's the marketing element. Then when your boss is sitting around and someone in a managerial position higher than yours has left suddenly, and he's flailing about trying to figure out who he can slot into that position tomorrow because he doesn't have any time, your name might be the one that drifts up into his imagination.
Yeah.
Right.
I think a lot of people would be shocked how like non-credentialed certain people in high up positions actually are, simply by the opportunities afforded to them through hard work and going above the call of duty of the average person. Sometimes it'll be like, how did you become the, you know, producer for X person?
Oh,
I was just,
wow.
They asked me to do something, or I went out of my way to do it, and it was extremely high quality.
Yeah.
And
they gave me something else.
Yeah.
You bet. Well, we know on the objective predictors of success front, the best predictor for success in a complex enterprise is intelligence. And you know, there's not a lot you can do to crank up your raw intelligence. Although there are things you can do to stop making yourself stupider. So, well, that's something, you know. Right. Conscientiousness is diligence and dutifulness, orderliness, industriousness. It's the second best predictor.
Yep.
And you can discipline yourself to become more conscientious. And people do across time. As people get older, they get more conscientious. And so, you know, it's lovely to have as a gift from God an IQ of 145. But if you're willing to work, you know, like actually work and not just look like you're working, especially if you deliver if you strike when the iron is hot, that can move you in an awful long ways. We have lots of people in my organization who rose through the ranks in exactly that manner because they're at hand. You ask them to do something extra, and maybe just as a test. You know, this guy seems pretty good at what he's doing. Can we give him something else?
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, well, maybe he has potential that isn't exhausted by his current role.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's fun to find out about yourself, too. Okay, so you're writing away. And what do you start writing about? And how often, like, tell me about your writing routine to begin with and how you developed it.
In general, I would, when I'm most mentally sharp,
and when was that for you?
When I wake up, I try and stave off eating as long as I can to stay as mentally dialed, and I usually have about a 7 to 8 hour window where I can crank out whatever content creation on that day.
Okay, you found that was when you first woke up?
Yeah.
Yeah,
so,
I found the same thing. Even though I didn't like mornings, I was sharpest to write in the mornings.
Yeah, so I would typically sit down and just put on headphones and try and stay as uninterrupted as possible, go on airplane mode and crank away. And
noise canceling headphones, like to be silent.
Yeah.
Okay, so you weren't listening to music or anything else?
Sometimes I listen to soft music that's not totally distracting.
Right.
It just depends on my mood for that day. But you know, I wouldn't have anything on the background like a show or hardcore music or anything.
Yeah, well, I found especially when I was writing seriously, it's like, no, I love listening to music. It's like, no, you can't, if you're serious about what you're doing, you can't allow for distraction. Now, you said as well that you found that didn't bother you as long as you were writing about something you're interested in because you were willing to get obsessive about it. I actually think that's a very fundamental male trait, by the way, that unidimensional obsessiveness driven by interest, partly because that is the pathway to success. That's the golden pathway to success for sure. That is the thing so I think that calling, that spontaneous interest is actually that manifestation of the instinct that leads to success. It's deeply rooted in you biologically, way the hell down below your cognitive systems, way, way down. So if you tap into that, man, it's a powerful motive force.
No, absolutely, yeah. So for me at the time, I was obsessed primarily with body composition and looking good and performing well, and that led me into the performance enhancement side of things. But then further down the road to that, I learned about the detriments and dangers of it, and that led me down the preventative medicine pathway, where I became far more passionate about longevity, vitality, and it led me to my primary business endeavors at this point, which is Merrick Health, my preventative medicine platform. And through the knowledge on pharmacology and supplementation, I started a supplement company with my co-founder, Chris, and continued to make content thereafter that was more aligned with my current interests, which has transitioned over time less. Because obviously, as you get older and more mature, it's not like, even the name, I've considered changing it because it's not like 23-year-old, more plates, more dates. Derek is the same as me now, years later, where I'm far more interested in science-based longevity tactics, blood work analyzation, preventative medicine as a whole, and my content is less oriented.
I think you actually have to score a line.
Yeah, okay. So let's think about that too here, because one of the things you said was that when you went to university, you had a vague sense that business was your thing, right? It's a very low resolution representation, but that doesn't mean it was wrong. It just meant that it wasn't finely honed. Right, it still pulled you in the right direction. Okay, so when you're 23 and you're writing about more plates, more dates, I mean, you have a compelling interest right at hand, which is your developing interest in women and being attracted to women, and so that would go along with looking good, and then that would you can see how that would segue into a deeper interest in something like performance, right? Because it's like, well, what does it mean to look good? Well, that can be flashy and surface, but people will figure that out pretty damn quick if they have any sense, right? And so there has to be something deeper under that, and that could be something like, well, health and performance, because it really is the case that the truest form of looking good that's sexually attractive is actually associated with optimized health. So, for example, the markers that we find attractive in the opposite sex, say, and vice versa, are markers of biological health. So waist to hip ratio in women, 0.68, is optimized for fertility, right? And so symmetry which is a very important determinant of physical attractiveness. Symmetry is an indication of untrammeled neurological and physiological development. So if you're symmetrical, it indicates that you haven't encountered pathogens or impediments in your developmental pathway that twisted and hurt you in some way that would be more than merely skin deep. Right now, I'm not saying that everybody who isn't symmetrical, has their underlying problems. I'm saying that if you're looking for a quick and dirty marker of something like biological integrity, symmetry is a great one. Butterflies, this is so cool. You know how beautiful butterflies are. They've worked on that a long time. They can detect deviations from symmetry in a potential mating partner of 1 part in a million. Wow. Right, and they're butterflies. Like, how they do that is just, like, it's just a miracle that they can do that. I have no idea how that's even possible, but the results are at hand, right? Because a lot of the beauty in butterflies is a consequence of sexual selection. Yeah. I saw this really cool butterfly at one point, just a picture of it. When it closed its wings, it was a leaf, and completely identical to a leaf. And when it opened it, it was beautiful like a butterfly is. And so the natural selection had tuned it to look like a leaf, and the sexual selection had tuned it to be spectacularly beautiful. And natural selection, or sexual selection, which is the selection of mates by at least somewhat conscious agents, it's a major force that governs evolution. And our sense of beauty is a consequence of sexual selection. So now you can imagine that as a young man, the way that instinct to self-development, the self-development that best produces survival and reproductive fitness over the long run, makes itself manifest as the desire to be attractive to women, right? And then the women become the judge of performance. And then you could imagine that if you pursued that diligently, like you did, that would start to deepen. Yeah. Right. So now you started to become concerned with performance rather than looking good per se, and then that broadened out into a much deeper understanding of physical health primarily, or would you say how much physical health and how much mental health?
I suppose at the time I didn't really have a huge focus on mental health. It was more cognitive function as a whole. So how sharp, witty, charismatic, these were all things that stemmed from having multiple conversations with attractive and otherwise intimidating women that then bled into business interviews and presentations and things that I noticed, oh wow, my conversational capacity was like significantly elevated just by exposing myself to these like otherwise fear-inducing encounters with attractive women. Now
unpack that.
Sure.
Okay, so first thing I would say to that is the best way to sustain and develop your cognitive function is through physical exercise. Cardiovascular and weightlifting. It's way better than doing cognitive exercises. Now, but you pointed to something else more specific, which was that part of the impetus you had to foster your ability to communicate came as a consequence of conversations that you had with challenging women. Okay, so tell me how that developed.
If you're like most Americans, you're struggling to make ends meet. Everything is more expensive these days. By the time you pay your bills, fill up your car, and go grocery shopping, there's almost nothing left. You're using your credit card more than you'd like. And last I you rate all of average I-10 dope debt through 88.net. The 5 start at 6.406%.
It wasn't necessarily that I sought out as a goal to, if I talk to attractive women, it will then lead to business success.
Of course.
But it was an indirect byproduct that I noticed was a fringe benefit. And for me, at least at the time, the most challenging and anxiety-inducing activity was walking up to a woman who is very attractive that you didn't know and being able to introduce yourself and have a fluent and articulate conversation.
Right.
So after that had been accomplished and I could repeat it.
Okay, so how did you feel? Okay, so there's a shift there, eh? Because to begin with, if I understand it correctly, your primary focus was on something like physical appearance, right?
Yeah.
And you had your reasons for that. I mean, you were tall and thin, and you needed to fix that up. But then this other idea comes in. You start to notice that the manner in which you're being evaluated by women has something to do with the surface features that we've been talking about, symmetry and muscle mass and physical confidence, all those things you can build up with weightlifting. But then there was a cognitive component. Like, I don't think there is much more that's much more attractive to women than the capacity to be articulate. I mean, poets do just fine. Musicians do just fine, right? And it's in no small part a reflection of the charisma of their capacity to be articulate.
Yeah.
Right. And this is something that's terribly badly taught to young men.
If at all.
Right? Well, it's never taught to them. It's so appalling, because if you took a group of 13-year-old guys and you sat them down and said, you're kind of useless and hideous. And one of the things that you could do to be much more attractive to women is to become a hell of a lot smarter than you are, and to learn how to show that and to explain why that is. Their motivation for attending, let's say, to English literature, this is something Willink again learned. I mean, when he was a commander in the Naval SEALs, one of the things he learned was, for example, that he couldn't speak for his men properly unless he could make an articulate account of their battlefield performance, right? And that his performance as a leader was dependent on his ability to be articulate. Then you see people like Russell Brand, for example, who are so articulate that it's just beyond comprehension. And you can see exactly the charisma that rappers are exactly the same manifestation of exactly the same sort of thing. So I also think it's pretty damn funny this week that Ben Shapiro is now the world's #1 rapper.
Oh yeah, I haven't watched that music video.
Oh my God, it's so funny, especially because Shapiro, I mean, he's a rapid fire speaker, so it's not that surprising, but he's been like criticizing rap as not being music hip hop for years. And
right.
So like, this is so comical, but it's a good, we can look at the underlying reason why that poetic gift is so attractive. It does indicate your capacity to be articulate, and that is a great indicator of your general competence. Okay, so you were learning that, I noticed too, speaking with you today, you don't have any of the common errors that people often make when they're speaking. No ums, no ahs, no likes, none of that, none of that filler, and that you take your time to pause when you need to pause. And all of those bad habits of communication seem to have been completely taken out of you. Now, you've been doing YouTube videos for a long time. So now you started to pay attention to more verbal articulation. Did that develop along with your interest in writing?
Yeah, I think the writing was just a byproduct of the only medium I knew of to communicate my knowledge at the time. It was not necessarily that I had a huge passion for it and I sought out to write elaborate and in-depth content because I loved writing. It was more, this is the medium by which you reach people and give value. And then via that, I realized, you can build a far more intimate relationship with the viewer They can associate with your journey as you develop, etc. over video, and infinitely more time efficient as well. Oftentimes I would try and publish a coinciding article at the same time as the video, and the proofreading process, even taking a transcript that was already written for me of what I said in a video and making it perfected for all the grammatical corrections that would be necessary for it to be actually publishable online. It was the time equivalent of filming 5 more videos. I just eventually, and this is, I think, my last